Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Appreciate it. Glad you came. Glad to see a couple new faces. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn about Michigan's endangered butterflies and some of the things that are being done to help. My name is Rifton Graham. I am the MSU Extension Master Gardener Coordinator for 7 counties in Southwest Michigan. I'm also the owner of several small businesses in and around Kalamazoo and a master beekeeper from University of Montana. You have joined us today in one of our many educational programs that's hosted by Rockhound Adventures, which is the educational part of our rock shop, located in Galesburg, Michigan. So we host many different interviews and podcasts and webinars about everything science and nature. If you're interested in any of the future programs coming up, you can always pop on to rockhoundrockshop.com and find out more about Rockhound Adventures. Tonight, we are here with David Pavlik. He's a research assistant at the Haddad Lab at Michigan State University, who's working with a few different endangered species here in Michigan at John Ball Zoo. He's going to talk a little bit about the project and what things they are doing to try to save these butterflies. So with that, I will turn it over to David.
All right, thanks, Riff, and thanks for having me on this series. I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's the work that we're doing with endangered butterflies here in Michigan. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the Endangered Butterfly Program that I work with at the John Ball Zoo. And the John Ball Zoo is located in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this program's been running since 2021. So as Riff said, my name is Dave Pavlik. I am a researcher in the Haddad Lab at Michigan State University. I've been working with endangered butterflies since 2019 when I first joined Nick's lab. I first started working with an endangered butterfly in North Carolina called the St. Francis satyr, which is actually a subspecies of an endangered butterfly that we have here in Michigan that I'll be talking a little bit about tonight, the Mitchell satyr. And so I managed that program for several years before moving all of my endangered butterfly work now to Michigan. The two species that we're working with at the John Ball Zoo currently are Mitchell satyr and Poweshiek skipperling. This is what they look like. Mitchell satyr on the left, Poweshiek skipperling on the right. Most of this presentation will be about the Poweshiek skipperling because that is the species that we have been working with for the longest at the John Ball Zoo. We just started working with Mitchell satyr in 2023, and so that program is still a little new, but I will touch on some of the work that we're doing with that species as well. So first of all, just what is a Poweshiek skipperling? This is a butterfly that honestly not a lot of people even know exists. And that's a shame because it's actually one of the most critically endangered animals in the entire world. Not just one of the rarest butterflies in Michigan, but it's actually one of the rarest animals in the world. And so this is a map on the right of what their historic range looked like in back, in 100 years ago was one of the most abundant butterflies in the Midwest. You could see them almost everywhere you went. Their core range was in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, but that range just barely extended east into Michigan, where we find them in some of the remaining prairie fens that we have in Michigan. And so they've used two kind of different types of habitat out in the Midwest, west of Michigan. They used these much drier tall grass prairies, and in Michigan they used these much wetter prairie fens. And so all of those little black dots on the map there are populations that used to exist. And unfortunately, today, this is what we're down to. So we only have, that we know of, about maybe two or three populations of this species left in the entire world. One of those populations remains in Manitoba, Canada. And then Michigan actually has the only remaining population of this butterfly in the entire United States. And it's only found in one county in the eastern part of Michigan. And we came dangerously close to losing this species altogether in 2022, which I'll touch on in a second here. This is a little closer view of where we do know that Poweshiek skipperlings used to exist in Michigan. There actually were quite a few populations scattered around the state, mostly on that east side of the state. So those triangles are historical populations, and then those green circles are everywhere that the prairie fens exist in Michigan. A prairie fen is a very unique type of habitat. And in the photo on the right there, you can see what a typical prairie fen looks like. It's very wide open. There's not a whole lot of canopy cover. It has the host plants that the Powashiek skipperlings need, including prairie dropseed, but it also, very importantly, has the nectar sources that the Powashiek skipperlings also need. So black-eyed Susans and shrubby cinquefoil are very important nectar sources for the species. Unfortunately, prairie fens have been disappearing from Michigan due to development, alteration of waterways, and so not only is it Powashiek skipperling that is disappearing, it's the habitat that they depend on and the habitat that a lot of other species other than Powashieks depend on as well. So how did we get from being one of the most abundant butterflies in the Midwest to almost seeing this species go extinct? Well, unfortunately, this species has quite a few threats that it's facing on the landscape every single year, and it seems like those threats are just getting bigger and bigger. So the first one is habitat destruction, and this really did a number on the species. It's a very this butterfly needs a very specific type of habitat, those prairies and prairie fens. And we know that historically we have now lost over 99.9% of the prairie fens that used to exist. And so when you take out that much of their habitat where the specialist needs that habitat to survive, you're ultimately going to lose the species that depend on those types of habitat. So habitat destruction really was the kind of the first step towards those populations declining. What we think's happening more recently is this use of neonicotinoid pesticides. And so these pesticides have kind of been adopted in the early 2000s. They're really good at what they do, unfortunately, for the butterflies and the other species that come in contact with this pesticide. The plants actually soak up this pesticide from their roots. It's a systemic, and it can last in the environment for years and years and years. And any insects that feed on those plants will ultimately die from this. And so it's not typically used in prairie fens, but it's used in agriculture. And what happened in the early 2000s was that it would actually aerial spray these neonicotinoids. And so if there was any habitat adjacent to the agricultural fields, those neonicotinoids would get into those adjacent habitats and get in through the waterways, and it really just would proliferate around that area. So it really didn't just stick to agriculture. And when we saw the more agriculture using these neonicotinoids more was when we saw a really big decline again in the populations of Powashiek skipperlings. So these are really powerful pesticides. They're actually outlawed for use in Europe and other countries. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of regulations around their use here in the United States. We're also seeing some effects of climate change, and there are various ways that climate change could be affecting both of the species that I'm talking about here tonight. There's not a whole lot of snow pack on the ground consistently in the winter, although this winter's been a little better. The growing seasons are also extending, and so there might be some sort of phenological mismatch between when those caterpillars wake up in the winter and when their host plants start growing. And if they are moving around and don't have anything to eat, that can be bad. The growing periods are extending longer into the fall and winter, and so all of these changes can be affecting these species in various ways. I kind of touched on it briefly, but hydrological changes can result in these prairie fens becoming unsuitable habitat really quickly for these species. These prairie fens have this really important groundwater component that help dictates the species composition, the plant composition in these areas. And when that waterway is disrupted, other plants start to move in, especially plants that are not usable for Powashiek skipperlings and Mitchell satyrs and other things that use prairie fens. Ultimately, what we've seen, and I'll show you on a graph here in a second, is some of these populations get hit by all of these different population threats. They have such a low number of individuals every year after that, they're just not able to bounce back. They're not able to rebound on their own. Including in that, you have issues with the extinction vortex through various different issues like inbreeding depression and they're just not able to get back up to those historical population levels. And that's kind of where the work that I'm doing with the John Ball Zoo helps them start to rebound, and I'll talk about that in a second. So Michigan Natural Features Inventory is the group in Michigan that goes out every year and monitors the Poweshiek skipperlings in their populations. And so this figure shows from 2014 through 2023 what those populations look like. So you can see after 2016, the species really got hit pretty hard. Each one of these lines is a different population. Most of those populations have blinked out, and we now, you can see in 2022 how close we got to losing all of the Poweshiek skipperlings, not only in Michigan, but that would be the entire United States. And so you can see a little bit of an uptick there in 2023, and that's after we started doing some of the work that I'll talk about here shortly. In 2022 was a very scary year for us. Michigan Natural Features Inventory and all of their standardized surveys combined across the state only saw 9 wild butterflies. So it's really good that we started working with this species in 2021 before that really big final crash. So we started and we joined the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership, which is a coalition of organizations and individuals ranging from Manitoba, Canada, where they still have those populations, throughout the Midwest and Michigan, all getting together to try to save this species from extinction. We joined that group in 2021 when the Haddad Lab and the John Ball Zoo came together, and we initiated what we're calling the ex situ program. And so ex situ is just a fancy word for conservation action that we are doing in a controlled facility, not out in the wild. So that would be out in the wild would be in situ. So this is what we call our ex situ facility. This is where we do all of the work with Poweshiek skipperlings for our part of the project. And that picture on the left there is what we started with back in 2021, one small hoop house that we set up ourselves. That picture on the right is now how fast those facilities have expanded and grown, and we're even talking about growing the facilities even more. So it's been really successful so far. We've been able to grow the programs, and we're really happy with the trajectory that we've been on. So in 2021, that's when we joined the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership, and the Minnesota Zoo had been working with this species for longer than we have, and they had 32 Poweshiek skipperling caterpillars that were going to turn into butterflies in 2021. And instead of releasing those butterflies back into the wild, the decision was made that those butterflies were going to come to the John Ball Zoo, and we were going to attempt to breed them in captivity consistently for the first time ever. So this is something that had never been done before, but we needed to get to a point where we could release hundreds and hundreds of butterflies back into the wild. Releasing 32 butterflies out into the wild is not going to have any sort of positive impact on those remaining populations. And so we thought through captive breeding, we could increase the number of individuals we're working with every year, and hopefully moving forward 2022, 23, 24, be releasing a lot of butterflies back into the wild. But for that to happen, we had to figure out if we could actually breed the species in captivity. It had been done accidentally, like once or twice, but never consistently. And so this was really the first big test. And if this wasn't going to work, unfortunately, the species was probably not going to make it. If we could figure out how to breed them in captivity, we wanted to then establish an insurance population at the John Ball Zoo. And so that insurance population is really important. It's one of the most important parts of our program, in my opinion, because those populations, like I said in 2022, down to, the last 9 individuals seen, we could go out any year now and not find these butterflies. And that's really scary. And so the insurance population at the John Ball Zoo is a group of butterflies that stays at the John Ball Zoo every single year for captive breeding, year after year after year, so that if they go extinct in the wild, we'll still have butterflies at the John Ball Zoo to work with, build those populations up, and then release a lot of butterflies back into the wild. You never want to be in a situation where you have to maintain an insurance population for a species, because that means that they are doing so poorly in the wild that there is a real chance that you could go out and not find them. And so that's a really important part of our program. But ultimately, we don't want to keep all of those butterflies at the John Ball Zoo. The main goal for this is to get as many butterflies back out in the wild as possible to help those last remaining populations hang on until we can get to the point where we can try to establish new populations. So that's what we were getting ourselves into in 2021. Before I reveal any of the results, I do want to talk a little bit about the life history of this species because this is kind of important to understand, and this is very similar for Mitchell satyr as well. So, unlike monarchs that have several generations in a single summer, Poweshiek skipperling and Mitchell satyr both only fly as an adult one time per year, and it's a very short flight. So, it's for about 3 weeks at the beginning of July, for about the first 3 weeks of July, and that's it. So when we're doing the captive breeding, when we're doing the releases, all of that has to take place in a very short period of time. And if we miss that window, we have to wait for the next year to be able to do anything. And so for that brief short period of time in July, the adults are flying, breeding, laying eggs. And at the John Ball Zoo, we're breeding the butterflies, we're collecting the eggs, we're rearing those caterpillars. Basically, about 90, more than 90% of the year, we're taking care of caterpillars. And so those caterpillars that hatch in the summer go into a state called diapause, which is basically hibernation for those caterpillars, where they don't move, they don't eat. They basically go into hibernation for anywhere from 5 to 6 months. And pretty soon, with these temperatures warming up here in Michigan, in about end of April, beginning of May, these caterpillars will wake up from their diapause and start eating again, and we'll have butterflies again in July. So one quick flight period, the rest of the time we're taking care of caterpillars. 2021 was really successful for our program. Of those 32 butterflies that Minnesota Zoo brought down to us, we were able to get 8 pairs to breed. And so of those 32, about half are male, half are female, and we were able to get 8 breeding pairs from that. We almost collected 600 eggs from those breeders, and at that time was by far the most eggs for the species that had ever been in captivity by, several times. And so this was our first indication that they can breed in captivity. At least we did it for a year. We don't know what that means for future years, but we were able to get enough to breed that we thought that this would be a viable option to continue doing into the future. The one downside for our program that year in 2021 was that we didn't have a whole lot of our caterpillars that hatched survive until that diapause period. And so with a few tweaks to our methods, we thought that going into 2022, this would be the thing that we key in on the most. We want to figure out how to get those caterpillars to survive better because ultimately that'll mean a lot more butterflies to be released. So going into 2022, we had another record-breaking year at the John Ball Zoo. We bred 17 pairs of Poweshiek skipperlings. This is again more indication that we can do this consistently. We collected almost 1,700 eggs from those females that were laying eggs at the John Ball Zoo. And so you can see just how quickly a captive breeding program for a species that's extremely rare that started with 32 butterflies can start to accelerate and have a lot of individuals that can be released. And every year we share some of those eggs that we produce here at the John Ball Zoo with the Minnesota Zoo. And this year was also very successful for keeping those caterpillars alive. So we had about, I think that's about a 70% survival to diapause. So just at the John Ball Zoo, we had over 500 caterpillars that we were taking care of over the winter of 2022. And so we thought that that would mean a lot more butterflies that could be released into 2023. But remember, I said 2022 was one of the, well, definitely the scariest year that we've ever had for the species because only 9 were seen in the wild. And so we didn't have to retain all of those butterflies for captive breeding. We hit the numbers that we were looking for, and we were able to release 102 adult Poweshiek skipperlings back into the wild in Michigan this year. So while only 9 were seen in the wild, we were able to release over 102 from our captive breeding facility. And so we realized that that wasn't going to be the thing that ultimately saves the species. 102 butterflies sounds like a lot compared to the 9 that were out there, but it's really still a low number when you think about breaking those up between several different locations. And so while we knew that this wouldn't be the thing that saved them, we were hoping this would just buy us a little bit of time and keep those remaining populations on the landscape until 2023 when we felt like we could probably be releasing a lot more butterflies. So 2023 was again another really successful year at the John Ball Zoo. You can see how every single year we're trying to increase the number of breeding pairs that we have, increase the number of eggs that we're working with, because that ultimately just means more butterflies going out in the wild. That's really what we're trying to get at the core of this program. And so we had over 30 breeding pairs at the John Ball Zoo. Minnesota Zoo started doing a little bit of breeding at their facilities. And so we collected almost 4,000 eggs between the two facilities. And so we shared again some of those eggs with the Minnesota Zoo. Um, but this was again a record-breaking year for the number of butterflies that we were able to release. And so 523 butterflies went out into the wild in Michigan this year. That's up from that 102 in 2022. And this is a number that we felt really good about. And one of the reasons we felt good about this is because we were able to witness our butterflies now at a really high level of butterflies going out. We saw them actually breeding out in the wild. They were breeding with wild individuals, they were breeding with zoo-reared individuals. And so that picture on the right is an example of two butterflies that we released from the John Ball Zoo, a male and a female that found each other out in the prairie fens and are breeding together. And it's really exciting because you don't know how these animals are going to react. They've been raised in captivity basically their entire lives. And so we didn't know if they would act normal when we released them. We hoped they would, but this is really good indication that they're finding each other, they're breeding. We're starting to see those populations bounce back from the really low number, the 9 in 2022. And so this really gave us some hope that if we can just keep doing this year after year and increasing those butterflies, maybe this species actually has a fighting chance. And so we really needed to continue to do this and see, what this big release, 523 butterflies going out in 2023, would we see in 2024 a population increase? So this is what we just did this past 2024 summer. So we had 50 breeding pairs at the John Ball Zoo. Again, another record for us. Many eggs laid. We shared those with the Minnesota Zoo. We had over 1,600 hatch at the John Ball Zoo. And we released over 1,450 butterflies back into the wild. And so that's a huge number of Powesheik skipperlings that are going out every single day onto the landscape in July in Michigan. And so we're really happy with that number. At this point, we've almost maxed out the number of caterpillars that we can raise at the space that we have at the John Ball Zoo. But again, we saw these butterflies breeding with each other and breeding with wild butterflies, moving around the landscape where we released them. So really exciting on that front. But what's also really exciting is that we finally had enough butterflies that we could release, that we could attempt the first reintroduction of the species. So we felt really good about the number of butterflies that we were releasing at sites where they were still hanging on. And we had enough butterflies that we felt like we could attempt the first reintroduction. So this is a site these butterflies went to where there used to be Powesheik skipperlings, and we have a really good idea of why they disappeared. So an invasive species called glossy buckthorn basically came in and wiped out all of the prairie fen habitat and pushed all of those species out, including Powesheik skipperling. But the land manager that we work with has gone in year after year and restored that area to the point now where it looks really, really good. It has the host plants, it has the nectar sources. It looks like a prime location to be releasing Powesheik skipperlings. And so we released over 500 butterflies just to that site this year. So in 2025, in just a few months, in July, we will go back to that site and see if there are Powesheik skipperling butterflies flying there. If there are, that's a good indication that we can start new populations using the methods that we've developed. If we can start new populations in Michigan, we're going to eventually start trying to start new populations across the historical range. So places like Minnesota, places like North and South Dakota, Wisconsin. We want to get these butterflies back across the range where they used to be. And so 2025 is going to be a really, really important year for what we see in the wild. After releasing almost 1,500 butterflies and starting a new reintroduction, we would expect that we're going to see a significant increase in those populations in Michigan. So here's that very similar figure to what I showed you earlier. And if you look at 2022, that was that scary year where we only saw 9 in the wild, but we released over 100 butterflies that year. And so you can see going into 2023, there was a little bit of an uptick. 2023 is when we released the 500 butterflies. And you can see how those 500 butterflies going into 2024, a significant increase in those wild populations. And so if we saw that significant of an increase after releasing 500 butterflies, we're really hopeful that 2025 surveys will show a lot more butterflies because, again, we released almost 1,500. And so this is a good way for us to track if what we're doing is actually working. And so far, starting with 2022, every year those populations have increased. Still not to the historical levels that they once were, and we're not out of the woods yet, but at least we're seeing these species starting to rebound, which is something that we haven't seen for a really long time. And so this is again just really good indication that what we're doing is working. So from those 9 wild butterflies that were observed in 2022, this past survey season, MNFI saw 194 butterflies, wild butterflies. That does not include the butterflies that we released. So that's what we're doing for the Poweshiek skipperling program, one of the rarest butterflies in the world. We're starting to see those efforts pay off. This year, we have even more ambitious plans. We're planning on breeding more butterflies than we did last year. We're hoping to release more butterflies than we did. We're possibly even going to be doing another reintroduction or at least getting a new location at one of the currently extant sites going and releasing butterflies there so that they can interact more. And so we keep pushing that program forward every single year. And because of how successful that has been in just a short period of time, the Fish and Wildlife Service asked us if we were interested in working with another endangered butterfly at the John Ball Zoo, and that is the Mitchell satyr. And of course, we were excited to do this. Mitchell satyr and St. Francis satyr that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. St. Francis satyr is found in North Carolina. It's the butterfly that I started working on when I joined Nick's lab. Nick has been working with that species for over 20 years, so we're really familiar with this Mitchell satyr, St. Francis satyr complex. We've had really good success in North Carolina with them. And so we figured we could use some of that success from that program and what we've learned with Poweshiek and get this Mitchell satyr ex situ program off the ground. And so this just started in 2023. The Mitchell satyr is it's not as rare as the Poweshiek skipperling. It's still a very rare butterfly. It's still federally endangered. But there are some populations scattered across Michigan and across the United States. So it used to be found in Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, and New Jersey. All of those populations have disappeared. They're not found in those states anymore. There are still butterflies in Virginia. There are butterflies in North Carolina, which is a different subspecies. There are populations in Alabama and Mississippi. And we're doing some genetic work with those right now. And we actually think that those are not the same subspecies as the ones in Michigan. And so Michigan right now is kind of its own subspecies. And there's only a few populations of that subspecies than in the United States, and they're all in Michigan, which makes it that much rarer. And so there are still some healthy populations in Michigan. 1 or 2 populations are still doing pretty well, but their other populations are declining year after year, and we've lost populations just in the last few years. And so this is a species that we're trying to get ahead of it so that it doesn't get as bad as Poweshiek skipperling. So that picture on the right is what Mitchell satyr prairie fen habitat looks like. There's a little more canopy cover. The satyrs seem to like a little more shade. But that is the group from the John Ball Zoo, from the Kalamazoo Nature Center, and from the Haddad Lab out collecting the first founders for our program. So we go out and collect those females, bring them into the John Ball Zoo, and they lay eggs, and then we release them. And so the guy on the left there is Bill Flanagan. He is the conservation manager at the John Ball Zoo. And so he helps manage these programs with me and make sure everything's running smoothly. So the first thing we wanted to do is just see if we can get the species to lay eggs in captivity and raise those caterpillars. So in early July 2023, we collected 15 females from the wild. We collected almost 400 eggs, and we had a really high hatch rate on those eggs. You can see that picture on the right there is one of the females laying eggs on a dead blade of sedge. And so those eggs are collected every single day, put in an incubator, and right before they're about to hatch, we get those eggs back onto their host plants. So we started off pretty well. The big hang up for this program right now is the overwinter survival for the species. We have really high overwinter survival for Poweshiek skipperling at the John Ball Zoo. It's anywhere from 95% or higher, so we lose very few individuals over winter. We use the same technique for Mitchell Satyr that we did for Poweshiek skipperling. They used to be found in the same fens together, so we thought that that would work, but we only had about a 50% survival rate of those caterpillars. And so going into this winter, actually right now, this is the area that we're keying in on the most, trying to figure out the best strategy to keep these caterpillars alive over winter. Because if we can get that number higher, again, that just means more butterflies that can be released in the future. It's still a number that is not terrible. It's probably pretty representative of what happens in the wild. There have been a couple other programs that have attempted working with this species, and for whatever reason, this seems to be the area that is the hardest, is keeping these caterpillars alive over winter. So this number is relatively good, but we'd like to see it higher. This past year, though, we were able to release butterflies back into the wild. So after our first year of working with them, butterflies did go back into the wild. And importantly, we were able to get our butterflies to emerge at the same time as we were seeing butterflies in the wild emerging. And so that's what you ultimately want. You want to be releasing butterflies from your program while there are butterflies flying in the wild so that they can interact and breed and lay eggs and start that new generation. So we're really excited about that. We released 44 butterflies back into the wild. We also retained a few of those butterflies for captive breeding so that we could have more butterflies to work with going into 2025. One of the things that we also wanted to test in 2024 was just see if we could breed this species in captivity. We've done it in North Carolina with the other subspecies, but we hadn't ever tried with this subspecies in Michigan in a very different facility than we use down in North Carolina. And so if we really wanted to grow this program, instead of collecting more butterflies from the wild, if we can get them to breed in captivity, then we don't have to collect a lot more from the wild. We can just breed them and continue that insurance population and release more butterflies that way. So happy to say this was really successful. We got the crosses that we were looking for. We had 9 total captive breeding events at the John Ball Zoo. And actually, we released 6 of those females into the wild after they bred. And so we're really excited about that because that means that that female that bred should be gravid, should be ready to lay eggs as soon as we released her into the wild. She doesn't have to go out there and find a mate and hopefully survive and avoid predators. She should be ready to go and lay eggs right away. And so we're hoping what that means is that we'll see more butterflies recruiting into that population that way. So it's a pretty cool strategy if you can get it to work and breed those butterflies before they go out. But we also kept a few back and collected the eggs so that we could, again, just increase the number of caterpillars and butterflies that we can release next year. You know, we had released 44 butterflies in 2024, hoping to release a lot more butterflies going into the 2025. And we feel pretty good that we will be able to do that because right now we have over 600 caterpillars of the Mitchell Satyr spending the winter at the John Ball Zoo. So that's up from about, I think we had 150 over the winter of 2023. So we'll have a lot more to work with going into this year. Like I said, we wanted to really figure out how to keep the species alive over winter better. And so what we're doing this winter and what we started, back in December of 2024 was a bunch of different overwintering experiments. And so what we did last year was they all went into an environmental chamber at -4 Celsius. And that was about that 50% survival rate. And so we're trying a whole bunch of different things this year. We're trying them at -4 because we know that's about 50%. And if nothing else works, at least we'll have something to work with. We're trying them at 0 degrees in environmental chamber, at 2 degrees in an environmental chamber. And then we're also trying a more natural approach where we just leave them outside over the winter and see what happens and see maybe they survive better that way. And so we have some that are currently in our hoop house with insulation to kind of help block the wind. Might be more representative of what they experience in the wild. We have some that don't have insulation that are covered in our hoop house. And then we also have some that are uncovered outside, getting all of the snow, all of the rain, everything that the Michigan winter has to throw at them. And so we're actually getting our host plants ready. The sedges are already starting to regrow. And in probably about a month or maybe 5 weeks, those caterpillars will start moving around and then we'll be able to see what works best. So they start moving around a little before Powashiek. So we're really getting our host plants ready. We're already starting work in our greenhouse to get ready for these caterpillars. So there's a lot to be done. But we're really excited about these results because whatever of these experiments works best, we can use that in the future going forward as how we keep them alive over winter, and then that'll just increase the number of butterflies that we can release. Before I log off, I want to thank all of the different partners that we have, and I want to show just how important this partnership that we've developed really is, because while we're doing a lot of work at the John Ball Zoo, this is not something that we can take on by ourselves. And so we have this Michigan State John Ball Zoo relationship where we're doing the captive rearing and captive breeding, and we have those butterflies. We work with the Minnesota Zoo to help us with that. Assiniboine Park Zoo in Manitoba is doing the same thing for their populations. But it doesn't matter how many butterflies we have to release if there's not habitat to release them. Like I said, that habitat can get taken over by invasive species or the disruption of those waterways, or it can be adjacent to crops where there's pesticides. And so we're working with other organizations like Michigan DNR, Michigan Nature Association, some of the townships, and they're out there every single year managing the habitat so that there aren't invasive species, so that we have a place to release these butterflies. If they weren't doing any of that work, these areas would grow up really quickly and we would have nowhere to put these butterflies. So you can't have one without the other. And so those are very important partners for us. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service, we're working with endangered species, and that requires specific permits. It requires a lot of oversight, and they've been very, very supportive of this program from the beginning. And the vast majority of our funding, for better or for worse, actually comes from the government. It comes from Fish and Wildlife Service through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And so that has been a really consistent source of funding. There's a little more uncertainty about what that means now this year and what that means going forward. And so we're still working through some of that. But Fish and Wildlife Service has been one of the biggest supporters of this program since the beginning. And then, of course, I mentioned Michigan Natural Features Inventory. They're the ones that are actually on the ground every single day during the flight, telling us what they're seeing, telling us what's happening. We don't have the personnel or the ability to be out there every day in addition to doing all the rearing and breeding and releases. And so if we didn't know what was going on out there, we wouldn't know if this is working or not. We wouldn't know if those populations are increasing or decreasing or staying the same. And so they're a really important part of this program. There are so many other organizations and individuals that we work with, like native plant nurseries, so where we get host plants that we know have not been treated with pesticides. I mean, the number of individuals and organizations that we work with on this program is huge. And it really is probably the biggest coalition that I've seen for a butterfly to help save a butterfly from extinction, maybe with the exception of the monarch butterfly. But I really think if it wasn't for all of these people coming together and all of these groups coming together, this butterfly would likely have already disappeared from the whole US. So it's really enjoyable to work with all of these people trying to accomplish the same thing, trying to save these butterflies from going extinct. And, as being from Michigan, having this butterfly now only found in Michigan, something that's really unique. And I think it's just a testament to all of the work that has been done in Michigan. And that's probably the only reason this butterfly still exists. So Poweshiek skipperling and Mitchell satyr, we're going to continue working with them at the John Ball Zoo. We're also really excited because there's one other endangered butterfly in Michigan. It's called the Karner blue. And we just got permission from Fish and Wildlife Service to start working with that species. And so it's very possible in the next couple months, we will be initiating our Karner blue program. And that's a species that there's a lot of concern about right now. Again, populations are declining and climate change seems to be having a really negative effect on that species in particular. So we'll be hopefully working with all three species this summer. Hopefully we'll have a lot of exciting updates, especially with those Poweshiek numbers in the wild. Um, and with that, I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
We had one comment that says, looks so promising. Hopefully they can continue to thrive. One thing I like about these presentations is that in a world filled with an awful lot of negative, there are still positive things happening, which is really nice to hear. And if you don't get it enough, Dave, thank you for what you're doing. And everybody else, please convey that because this is good stuff. Um, Anything the general public can do to help? Planting black-eyed Susans, sedge, anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question because that's a question that comes up a lot when people hear about this species and being native to Michigan now only they want to help, right? Everybody wants to figure out how they can help. Unfortunately, this species is so rare now and it's found in very, very specific types of habitat that are closed off to the public. It's really hard to have a direct positive impact on Poweshiek skipperling that way. If you plant black-eyed Susans, you're not going to attract them to your yard at this point. But one of the things I tell people all the time, and this is really a timely update, is that it's not just Poweshiek skipperlings and Mitchell satyrs and Karner blues that are declining. It's insects all over the world that are declining. And so Nick Haddad, whose lab I work in, he was just one of the main authors on a paper that came out in Nature. I think it came out yesterday, actually. And it's the first comprehensive review of butterfly populations across the entire United States. And they found over the last 20 years that we've lost 22% of the butterflies on the landscape that we used to have. And that doesn't even take into account the rarest of the rare, like Poweshiek, because there wasn't enough data to analyze for those species. And so it's actually probably even much worse than that. But it's not just butterflies that are declining, it's bumblebees, it's other pollinators, it's animals across the world. And so one of the best things you can do is plant native plants in your garden, in your yard, in your communities, in your townships, because that is going to affect a lot more pollinators than just one species like Poweshiek skipperling. And so planting native, turf grass in your yard, it might look good to some people, but it doesn't really do anything for the species that really need these native habitats. And so I've completely transformed my front and backyard. It's all native plants now. I have so many bumblebees and butterflies that come into my yard, planting milkweed for monarchs. That is one of by far the best and the easiest thing that you can do to really start to have a positive impact on these populations right away. So plant native plants. It's something that I stress all the time, every single year.
All right. So I have just two questions right now. You were talking about incubating butterfly eggs. I ponder this image in my mind of what an incubator looks like for butterfly eggs. It's got to be pretty small. How do you incubate butterfly eggs?
Yeah, so we have environmental chambers that are actually pretty large. And we use those environmental chambers. They're like basically an industrial size like refrigerator. And we're able to control the temperature and the humidity and the light cycle. So we use those incubators for a bunch of different life stages. So we use them to incubate eggs. And so those eggs go into those incubators, relatively high temperature, high humidity. That really seems to help those eggs hatch. We also use it to boost the caterpillars after they hatch. So we can tune that temperature and humidity to exactly what they like so that they don't go straight from that incubator out into the hoop house where it could be 90 degrees and really sunny. And so we found that if we keep them in there for a couple days and they start eating first and then we take them out, they survive a lot better. So we use them for that life stage too. We also then use those same incubators to keep the caterpillars over winter. So for the Power Chic skipperlings, we have them all individually labeled in individual cups. So we know exactly the genetic lineage of what they are. And so that right now, all of our, I would say 99% of our caterpillars for Power Chic skipperlings are in that environmental chamber. And they're set at -4C. And they do take up a good amount of the incubator because we have, over 1,000 caterpillars in there. And so we have found ways to use those incubators for all different life stages.
Okay, good. Um, and then I had another one you may not know yet because you only had one season so far, but the Mitchell's Satyr, does anybody have any hunch about why they overwintered so poorly compared to the other one? And because you expect if they're in the same zone and the same even habitat, why they
Mhm.
would need such different. Anybody have any idea as to why that was so bad?
Yeah, so even though they are found in the same habitat and they were at one point back when we had more butterflies on the landscape, they were found in the same prairie fence together. It's very possible that they just have different overwintering strategies that they like these caterpillars have to adapt their bodies to be ready for cold temperatures. So in the fall, when the days are getting shorter, the nights are getting colder, the caterpillars have different ways that they can prepare their body for what can be a really brutal winter in Michigan. So they need to be able to withstand really, really cold temperatures. One of the ways that they can do that is by creating an antifreeze proteins within their body so that they can get below freezing and not freeze. So that's one strategy. Some species will just dehydrate the majority of the liquid in their body so that if there's very little liquid in there, has a lower chance of freezing. There's all sorts of different ways that these species can actually prepare themselves for overwinter. And so actually we had some caterpillars outside overwinter last year, and the Mitchell Satyr caterpillars started moving around when we got that really warm spell at the end of February. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like 70 degrees. It was crazy. They actually started moving around. The Powashik skipperlings that we had outside did not move at all. And so that really tells me that they just have a different way of preparing themselves for overwinter. It's totally possible that Mitchell Satyrs, because we had them at -4C all winter, it's totally possible that they just need freeze thaw cycles so that every once in a while it gets above freezing and they're not consistently below freezing for 6 months. It's totally possible that that is what is happening. And so that's why we have them in those environmental chambers at 0 and also +2, just above freezing. But we also have them outdoors and we have temperature and humidity monitors out there. So we'll know exactly what they experienced over the winter, freeze thaw cycles. And so it's going to be really interesting to see. Maybe we have the same thing. Maybe it's 50% survival. Maybe the species that they just don't do well over winter in general. We don't really know yet, but that's why we wanted to try a bunch of different things. We had enough caterpillars that we were able to do it so that going into next year, hopefully we'll have a good idea of what the best method is.
All right. And then the last one was, do you have supply a list of the best native plants to look for?
Yeah, so Michigan State actually has a really good website with plants that are native to Michigan with their blooming times, their flower colors, what they attract. And so if you just look up Michigan State University pollinator plants, you can find them that way. Some of my personal favorites are, I think there's like 6 different, maybe even more, different species of milkweed in Michigan. So I try to have a little bit of each of them in my yards and we get a lot of monarchs that come through and will lay eggs on those. So I really like milkweed. Um, I really like to try to get some things that bloom throughout the season. So like the spring all the way into the fall. So there's a lot of asters in the fall. Um, but I think one of the important things that a lot of people overlook is not just the flowers in the flower gardens, but the host plants for a lot of these species. And so the flowers will attract the adult butterflies, right? But most adult butterflies don't use flowers as their host plant. They need the sedges, they need the grasses. And so prairie dropseed, little blue stem, big blue stem, um, any other of like the sedges, so Carrick stricta sedge is what the Mitchell satyr uses, but a lot of other caterpillars will use that too. And so I always try to have like a few of each in my front yard and backyard because then you're guaranteed to get the most diversity that can use those plants. So the flowers are great, they're pretty, they're beautiful, everybody likes them, but I would just stress don't overlook the host plants for these species as well.
Great. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? If we don't have any more
I
questions,
think Stephanie's talking, but she's on mute.
oh, Stephanie, can you unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Hey, yes.
Okay, so when it comes, I want to get a bunch of native plants and stuff. How do I know whether what I'm getting is like, where do I get it and how do I know that it doesn't have pesticides on it already?
Excellent question. So that is really important because a lot of the plants that are sold at like big box stores actually are treated with something. And so I find that in Michigan, there are certain native plant nurseries that will not treat their plants. They are providing these plants specifically to benefit these species. And so, two of my favorites are Hidden Savanna in Kalamazoo. We use Hidden Savanna for all of our host plants at the John Ball Zoo. And so we buy a ton of plants from Chad, who runs that program. And he guarantees no pesticides, no herbicides. They are clean plants, and we've never had a problem with our caterpillars eating his plants. They're also just like some of the best looking plants that I've ever seen. And he will have shows in the spring and the fall where you can show up and you can ask questions and he'll have the plants right there. You can pick whatever you want. If you want, host plants, he can help you with that. He's one of the best native plant growers that I know of in the state, and that's why we use them. There's also another native plant nursery that's a little bigger and it's closer to Lansing. And the name of it is escaping me. Wild Type Nursery. And so they're bigger and they have probably maybe a little bit bigger of an offering than Hidden Savanna. But either one of those, you can't go wrong. But you can also, there are others too. Some of the universities in Grand Rapids have native plant sales now. I would avoid buying from places like Flowerland or Meyer or big box stores like that because a lot of times those are treated and a lot of times those aren't even the native cultivars to our area. You want the native plants that are native to our area, not one of the non-native cultivars. And so if you stick with the native plant nurseries, you will be set and they will help you find what you need.
Um, Hold on just a second. Does anyone else have? I have another question, but I can't remember it. Oh, how do I know exactly which species of native insects I have currently so that I can try to increase the populations that I already have?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you just have, like lawn right now and you're just starting your native garden, there's good chances that there probably aren't like, there's not a huge diversity. And that's one of the biggest benefits to starting a native pollinator garden because most of these pollinators are capable of pretty sizable movements and some of them even migrate seasonally. And so they will find it. That's one of the things that you will notice first how quickly they will find it. If you plant native flowers, you will get pollinating bees and flies and bumblebees that are really important to the environment. You'll get them really quickly. And that's one of the best things about starting one of these gardens. That's why I tell people it's the easiest thing that they can do to have a benefit, because the benefit is like almost immediate. As soon as those start flowering, you will see the insects coming into your yard, the native pollinators coming into your yard. And so you don't have to start very big. I would start with, just a small section. And depending on the sun or the shade, how much it gets, that can be important for when you're picking your plants. Um, but most of the time, those pollinators will be generalists. And so bumblebees will use a whole bunch of different types of flowers. So you don't have to really know exactly what species you have there right now. Most of them will use whatever those native flowers that you plant. So that alone, like once you plant them, they will come.
At the plant store, they would know everything. I'm near Kalamazoo, so they would know everything for the general area, like especially if I explain the terrain and stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, Hidden Savannah on their plant sales, they have a lot of that information, like on the little cards with those plants. They'll say this one does really well in full sun. This one needs partial shade. This one does really well in the shade. And so you can just kind of shop by that. If you have a little section of your yard that you know gets like a medium amount of sun, then you can just pick it out based on that information on the card, or you can ask the people there. They're really helpful. They love what they do. And that honestly, that's where I got the vast majority of my native plants for my yard. It's like every time we go there to buy plants for the butterfly program, I end up buying plants to bring back to my yard because I just can't help myself.
Awesome. It sounds like that's where I need to go to talk to about the plants.
If you're near Kalamazoo, that would be very easy for you to do. Yeah, and you can find them on Facebook. You can find them on their website. That's probably my favorite native plant nursery. There's a reason why we use them.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, we're going to let Dave get back to his evening at 6 o'clock. So we made it just at the right nick of time. So appreciate it. Thank you again, David, for coming and letting us know a little bit more about what you're doing. And hopefully we'll be able to get an update here in midsummer or this fall. So the
Yeah, it's
numbers
gonna
bigger and
get
better.
busy fast.
Good, good. Okay, thanks again, David.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Talk to y'all later.
And thank you everybody else for joining us. We're hoping you learned something. We're going to post this video online so you can watch it if you know anybody else who's interested in watching the recording. And we will be posting what the next topic is for the next class, the next webinar coming up here in a couple of weeks. So just keep an eye on our website for that. All right. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks again. Appreciate it.